Every parent knows there are few sounds more frightening than a child crying in a crowded place. It only takes a few seconds. A hand slips away. A crowd shifts. One wrong turn, and a family can be separated before either side realizes what's happened. Across the United States, countless children have been safely reunited with their parents thanks to strangers who refuse to ignore a frightened face in the crowd. Most of those stories end within minutes and are quickly forgotten. But every once in a while, one encounter refuses to make sense. Not because someone disappears forever, but because the people standing only a few feet away remember the same moment in completely different ways. Imagine hearing a little boy crying while everyone around you continues walking as though nothing is happening. You kneel beside him, speak to him, and promise you'll help him find his mother. Then you ask nearby strangers for assistance, only to have them stare back in confusion and ask a question that instantly changes everything. What little boy? Today's story is inspired by real reports of children becoming separated from their families in crowded public spaces and by documented accounts showing how memory, attention, and human perception can differ dramatically from one witness to another. Names, locations, and identifying details have been changed to protect privacy while preserving the emotional truth behind the events. Before we go any deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because sometimes the hardest mystery isn't finding someone. It's understanding why no one else remembers they were ever there. It was supposed to be an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when Rebecca Collins left the neighborhood grocery store carrying 2 reusable shopping bags toward the city park that shortened her walk home. At 49 years old, Rebecca had grown accustomed to routines. After years working as a pediatric nurse, she appreciated quiet afternoons more than excitement. The park was alive with ordinary life. Parents pushed strollers beneath tall oak trees. Children laughed near the playground. Joggers followed the winding paths while dog owners chatted near the fountain. Nothing appeared unusual until Rebecca heard a sound that immediately caught her attention. A child was crying. It wasn't the loud, impatient cry of someone asking for a toy. It was softer, frightened. The kind of cry she had heard countless times from children who suddenly realized the one person they trusted most was no longer beside them. Rebecca followed the sound until she noticed a little boy sitting alone on an old wooden bench beneath a large maple tree. He couldn't have been older than 6. His head remained lowered, and both hands tightly held a worn stuffed bear that looked almost as old as he was. Rebecca placed her grocery bags on the ground, slowly approached the bench, and knelt so she wouldn't frighten him. Gently, she asked if he was all right. The little boy slowly lifted his eyes toward her. Tears covered his cheeks as he quietly whispered, "I can't find my mom." Years of caring for frightened children took over without Rebecca even thinking about it. She reassured the little boy that everything would be all right and promised they would find his mother together. Then she looked around, expecting to see a panicked parent searching nearby. Instead, the park continued exactly as it had before. Families laughed together. Cyclists passed along the trail. A group of teenagers tossed a football across the grass. No one appeared to be looking for a missing child. Rebecca stood and stopped a middle-aged couple walking only a few feet away. She pointed toward the bench and asked, "Can you help me find this little boy's parents?" The couple exchanged confused glances before looking back at Rebecca. "What little boy?" the man finally asked. Rebecca frowned, assuming they had misunderstood her. She turned immediately toward the bench. The child was still sitting exactly where she had left him. His shoulders shook gently as he hugged the worn stuffed bear closer against his chest. Rebecca looked back toward the couple, expecting them to notice him now. Instead, both simply stared at her with polite concern, as though she were pointing toward an empty bench. The brief conversation ended awkwardly, and the couple quietly continued walking. Rebecca remained frozen, unable to understand what had just happened. She knew what she had seen. She knew the little boy had spoken to her. Yet everyone else behaved as though the bench had been empty all along. The encounter stayed with Rebecca long after she reached home. She replayed every detail repeatedly, questioning whether exhaustion after a long hospital shift had somehow affected her perception. But one detail refused to leave her mind. The little boy's face. His frightened eyes. The faded stuffed bear held tightly against his chest. Those memories felt far too vivid to dismiss. 3 days later, While researching old local newspaper archives for an unrelated community history project at the public library, Rebecca turned a page and suddenly stopped breathing for a moment. Looking back at her from a newspaper published decades earlier was the exact same little boy sitting on the exact same wooden bench with the exact same worn stuffed bear in his arms. The photograph appeared beneath a headline describing a child briefly separated from his mother during a crowded community festival held in that very park years before. Rebecca stared at the faded image in complete disbelief. Every detail matched the child she believed she had comforted only days earlier. And in that instant, she realized the mystery had only just begun. Rebecca Collins had spent more than 25 years caring for children during some of the most difficult moments of their lives. At 49 years old, she was one of the most respected pediatric nurses at her local hospital, known not only for her medical knowledge, but also for her remarkable ability to calm frightened children with nothing more than a reassuring smile and a patient voice. Parents often remembered her long after their hospital visits ended because Rebecca treated every child as though they were part of her own family. She had built a quiet life after her divorce, filling her days with long hospital shifts, volunteering at community health programs, and enjoying peaceful evenings at home. Friends frequently described her as the kind of person who noticed things other people overlooked. If a child looked anxious in a waiting room, Rebecca noticed. If an elderly neighbor struggled with groceries, she noticed. If someone needed help, she rarely waited to be asked. That instinct had become such a natural part of who she was that stopping for the crying little boy in the park never felt like a decision. It was simply what she had always done. Yet unlike every frightened child she had comforted throughout her career, this encounter refused to settle into memory as an ordinary moment. Instead, it grew more unsettling with every passing day. After discovering the decades-old newspaper photograph at the library, Rebecca found herself replaying the afternoon in the park over and over again, searching for details she might have missed. She remembered exactly how the little boy clutched the worn stuffed bear against his chest, as though it were the only thing making him feel safe. She remembered the uncertainty in his eyes when he quietly whispered, "I can't find my mom." She remembered placing her grocery bags on the ground before kneeling beside him. Most vividly of all, she remembered the confusion on the faces of the couple she had asked for help. They hadn't ignored the child. They genuinely seemed unable to understand who Rebecca was talking about. That realization disturbed her more than anything else. If everyone else had deliberately looked away, she could have explained it. Crowded places sometimes make people assume someone else will step in. But that wasn't what happened. The couple's expressions suggested they saw nothing at all. Rebecca questioned herself more than once. Had exhaustion after consecutive hospital shifts affected her concentration? Had she somehow connected a childhood memory to a stranger in the park without realizing it? She had spent enough years in healthcare to understand that human memory can sometimes fill gaps without permission. Yet every logical explanation collapsed the moment she looked again at the newspaper photograph. The little boy's face matched perfectly. The stuffed bear appeared identical, down to the worn fabric around one ear. Even the weathered wooden bench stood in the same location beneath the large maple tree. It felt less like coincidence and more like two moments separated by decades somehow sharing the same image. Unable to dismiss what she had experienced, Rebecca returned to the library the following afternoon, determined to learn everything she could about the old newspaper article. The brief report explained that the photograph had been taken during a crowded community festival after a young child became separated from his mother for a short period before volunteers safely reunited them. The article itself seemed ordinary enough, yet the image beneath it carried a weight Rebecca couldn't explain. She studied every inch of the faded picture, comparing it with the memory still vivid in her mind. The boy's posture was identical. The way he held the stuffed bear hadn't changed. Even the expression on his face was exactly as she remembered seeing only days earlier. Questions began multiplying faster than she could answer them. Who was the little boy? Why didn't anyone else in the park react to him? Had Rebecca somehow misunderstood what she witnessed, or had something else shaped her perception that afternoon? Most importantly, why did a photograph printed more than 20 years earlier look as though it had been taken only moments before she walked through the park? Rebecca believed she had comforted a frightened child. She had no idea she had uncovered a story hidden in plain sight for over 20 years. To understand why Rebecca Collins refused to dismiss what happened in the park, We have to step back one day, before the newspaper photograph, before the unanswered questions, and before one quiet afternoon changed the way she viewed a place she had walked through hundreds of times. Rebecca's life followed a rhythm built on compassion rather than excitement. Every morning began before sunrise as she prepared for another shift at the Children's Hospital where she had spent more than 25 years caring for young patients. She had become the kind of nurse parents requested by name because she possessed a rare ability to calm fear without rushing it. A frightened child who refused to speak would often begin smiling after only a few minutes with Rebecca. She never treated children as medical cases. She treated them as individuals whose fears deserved patience and understanding. After work, she usually stopped at the grocery store, visited an elderly neighbor who lived alone, and returned to the small home she had quietly rebuilt after her divorce. Her evenings were simple: a cup of tea, a favorite novel, and the peaceful silence that followed long hospital shifts. Friends sometimes teased her for always putting other people first, but Rebecca never saw kindness as a sacrifice. To her, it was simply the right way to move through life. That was exactly why the crying little boy in the park immediately caught her attention, while everyone else appeared absorbed in their own routines. Rebecca had spent too many years recognizing fear in children's eyes to simply walk past another frightened face. The reason children trusted Rebecca so naturally reached back much further than her nursing career. When she was only 12 years old, her family experienced several terrifying hours that would shape the rest of her life. During a busy holiday weekend, she and her younger brother became separated inside a crowded shopping mall. One moment he was walking beside her, and the next he had disappeared into a sea of unfamiliar faces. Rebecca still remembered the overwhelming panic that spread through her family as security officers searched every hallway, every store, and every exit. Although her brother was found safe later that afternoon, frightened and sitting alone near one of the mall entrances, those endless hours left a permanent mark on Rebecca's heart. She never forgot the fear she saw in his eyes when their parents finally reached him. Nor did she forget the kindness of the strangers who stayed beside him until help arrived. Years later, when Rebecca chose pediatric nursing as her profession, she often admitted that experience influenced her more than she realized at the time. From that day forward, she made herself one quiet promise. She would never ignore a child who looked frightened, confused, or alone. Whether it happened in a hospital hallway, a grocery store, an airport, or a city park, Rebecca believed that every child deserved at least one adult willing to stop and ask a simple question. Are you okay? That promise had guided countless ordinary moments throughout her life. None of them prepared her for the encounter waiting beneath the maple tree. As Rebecca continued thinking about the little boy, another detail slowly separated itself from the rest of the memory. At first, she had focused almost entirely on the mystery surrounding the newspaper photograph and the strange reactions of the people walking through the park. But now she realized there was something even more unusual about her conversation with the child himself. He never asked for food, despite appearing tired. He never asked Rebecca to take him home. He didn't ask to borrow a phone or call the police. In fact, he hardly spoke at all. Every time Rebecca gently tried to reassure him, he quietly repeated the same sentence in almost exactly the same way. She promised she'd come back. The words sounded less like a request for help and more like someone holding tightly to a promise they refused to stop believing. Rebecca remembered asking who he meant, but the little boy never answered directly. He simply hugged the worn stuffed bear a little closer and whispered the same sentence again. At the time, Rebecca assumed he was talking about his mother and thought nothing more of it. But after discovering the decades-old newspaper article, those 6 words suddenly carried a weight she couldn't explain. They echoed in her thoughts all evening, as though they belonged to a story much older than the afternoon in the park. Rebecca didn't realize those words had appeared in an old police report decades earlier. The morning after discovering the newspaper photograph, Rebecca Collins decided she could no longer dismiss the experience as simple confusion or exhaustion. Too many details matched too precisely. If there was a reasonable explanation, she intended to find it. Her first stop was the park's administrative office, where she calmly explained everything that had happened on the Tuesday afternoon she encountered the frightened little boy. The security supervisor listened patiently while Rebecca described the child, the worn stuffed bear, and the conversation that followed. Although he remained polite throughout, Rebecca noticed the careful expression people often wear when they are trying not to jump to conclusions. He agreed to review the security footage covering the area around the old wooden bench. Together, they watched recordings from multiple cameras positioned throughout the park. Rebecca immediately recognized herself entering the frame, carrying 2 grocery bags before stopping near the bench beneath the large maple tree. She watched herself kneel exactly where she remembered comforting the child. Her lips moved as though she were speaking, with someone seated in front of her. She even reached one hand forward in the same gentle way she often did while reassuring nervous children at the hospital. Yet from the camera's angle, the bench appeared empty. A tree branch partially blocked part of the view, making it impossible to see the entire seat, but there was no clear image of a child sitting there. The footage neither confirmed nor completely disproved Rebecca's memory. It simply left another unanswered question. The investigation only became more puzzling as park employees began speaking with people who had been walking nearby that afternoon. Several witnesses remembered seeing Rebecca stop beside the bench. A retired couple recalled noticing her place her grocery bags on the ground before kneeling for a few moments. A jogger remembered seeing her looking around the park as though searching for someone. Another visitor even remembered Rebecca speaking softly while gesturing toward the bench. But when each person was asked whether they had seen a little boy sitting there, every answer was exactly the same. No. Some assumed Rebecca had dropped something and was picking it up. Others believed she was talking on a hands-free phone. One woman suggested Rebecca might have been comforting a child who had already left before anyone else noticed. None of the explanations matched what Rebecca clearly remembered. She wasn't questioning a vague impression or a fading memory. She remembered the little boy's frightened voice, the worn stuffed bear pressed tightly against his chest, and the quiet sentence he repeated again and again. She promised she'd come back. The consistency of the witness's memories only deepened her determination. Instead of convincing Rebecca to abandon the mystery, they convinced her that the answers wouldn't be found inside the park. If the truth existed, it was probably waiting somewhere in the past. Rebecca returned to the public library and immersed herself in decades of archived newspapers, community newsletters, and historical records connected to the annual festival once held in the park. Hours passed as she carefully worked through article after article describing concerts, family events, volunteer organizations, and local celebrations. Then she found it again, the same newspaper clipping that had first captured her attention. This time, however, she studied every line instead of focusing only on the photograph. The article described how a young child had become separated from his mother during one of the festival's busiest afternoons before volunteers safely reunited them less than an hour later. Beneath the headline appeared the familiar image that now felt impossible to ignore. The same weathered wooden bench. The same little boy holding the same worn stuffed bear. The same solemn expression Rebecca had seen only days earlier. She compared the newspaper photograph to the memory fixed in her mind and found no meaningful difference between them. Even the position of the child's hands matched perfectly. As she continued reading, one small detail near the bottom of the article immediately caught her attention. The report mentioned that responding officers had documented the child's repeated statement while waiting for his mother to be located. According to the article, he told everyone who tried to comfort him only one thing. She promised she'd come back. Rebecca slowly lowered the newspaper and stared silently at the faded page. Those were the exact words she had heard in the park more than 20 years later. Not similar words. The very same sentence. In that moment, she realized this mystery wasn't finished. One detail in the article convinced Rebecca this story wasn't over. The name beneath the newspaper photograph gave Rebecca Collins her next lead. The image credit identified the photographer as James Porter, a longtime local newspaper journalist who had spent decades documenting the people and events that shaped the community before retiring several years earlier. After several phone calls, Rebecca learned James still lived only a few miles outside town. Unsure whether he would even remember a photograph taken more than 20 years ago, she contacted him and asked if he would be willing to meet. To her surprise, he agreed almost immediately. When Rebecca arrived at his modest home, she found shelves lined with neatly organized photo albums, newspaper clippings, and thousands of carefully labeled negatives collected over an entire career. James welcomed her inside with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime observing other people's stories rather than telling his own. As soon as Rebecca placed the faded newspaper clipping on the table, His expression softened. Before she could ask a single question, he nodded slowly and said, "I remember that afternoon better than most people would expect." According to James, the annual community festival had drawn one of the largest crowds the town had ever seen. Families filled every walkway, live music echoed across the park, and volunteers struggled to keep information booths organized as thousands of visitors arrived throughout the day. In the middle of all that activity, someone noticed a little boy sitting alone on the wooden bench beneath the old maple tree, clutching a worn stuffed bear and quietly crying while waiting for his mother. James happened to be nearby with his camera when volunteers approached the child, and instinct told him to preserve the moment, not because it was sensational, but because it reflected something deeply human. The photograph captured only a brief chapter in the story. Less than an hour later, the boy's mother found him, and the reunion ended with tears of relief from everyone who had helped. What began as a frightening experience ultimately became a reminder of how strangers can come together when one family suddenly needs them most. James carefully removed the original print from a protective folder and placed it beside the newspaper clipping. The details were even clearer than the published version Rebecca had already studied. Every crease in the stuffed bear, every weathered board on the old bench, and every expression on the little boy's face appeared exactly as Rebecca remembered seeing only days earlier. James explained that after the newspaper published the image, it quickly became one of the most recognized local photographs in the paper's history. Community organizations requested copies for safety campaigns reminding parents to keep children close during crowded events. Schools occasionally used it during family awareness programs. Local historians later included it in exhibits celebrating volunteers who served the town during major public gatherings. Over the years, thousands of residents had seen the photograph, even if many no longer remembered exactly where. Then James shared something he admitted he had rarely spoken about outside his own family. Every anniversary of that festival, someone would eventually contact the newspaper or the local historical society, claiming they had briefly seen a young boy sitting alone on the same bench with a stuffed bear. The stories varied slightly from year to year. Some insisted they heard quiet crying. Others remembered only noticing a lonely child before looking away for a moment. A few believed they watched someone comforting him, only to later realize no one else remembered the child being there at all. Investigations never uncovered evidence supporting those accounts. Security cameras never provided clear confirmation, and witnesses rarely agreed on exactly what happened. Most people concluded that the reports were simple misunderstandings. The photograph had become so familiar throughout the community that memory itself could easily fill in missing details without anyone realizing it. James never claimed the stories proved anything extraordinary. Instead, he believed they revealed something equally fascinating about human perception. Sometimes people notice details their minds have quietly stored for years without consciously remembering where they first saw them. A powerful image, combined with an emotional place, can create experiences that feel remarkably real. Rebecca listened carefully, appreciating James's thoughtful explanation, yet something continued to trouble her. She understood how memory could influence perception. Years in pediatric nursing had taught her that stress, emotion, and familiarity often shaped the way people remembered difficult moments. But one detail refused to fit comfortably inside that explanation. She had never seen the newspaper photograph before visiting the library several days after the encounter in the park. She couldn't have unconsciously recognized the little boy because, by every account she could verify, she hadn't known the image existed until afterward. More importantly, James had never mentioned the exact words printed in the police report or the sentence the little boy repeated while hugging the worn stuffed bear. Rebecca heard those words before discovering any newspaper article. She remembered them with absolute clarity. She promised she'd come back. James fell silent for a moment after hearing that detail. Then he looked toward the original photograph resting quietly on the table and admitted something that surprised even him. Very few people outside the original volunteers ever knew he kept repeating those words, he said softly. Rebecca felt the familiar weight of unanswered questions returning once again. She had entered James Porter's home expecting one mystery to be resolved. Instead, another had quietly taken its place. And somewhere beyond the photograph, the newspaper archives, and the stories passed from one generation to the next, one final discovery was waiting. Rebecca's final discovery would explain why the encounter felt so personal. Armed with everything she had learned from James Porter, Rebecca Collins followed one final lead that had been quietly waiting inside the newspaper archives all along. The article never identified the little boy beyond his first name, but later community records, public festival programs, and local historical society documents eventually led her to a man named Ethan Brooks. Now in his early 30s, Ethan lived only a few counties away and worked as a high school guidance counselor, dedicating his career to helping young people navigate fear, uncertainty, and difficult moments with the same patience others had once shown him. Rebecca reached out with a carefully written letter explaining that she had been researching the history of the community festival and wanted to ask about a photograph taken many years earlier. She deliberately avoided describing her experience in the park, uncertain how a complete stranger might react. Several days later, Ethan agreed to meet at a quiet neighborhood coffee shop. When Rebecca arrived, she immediately recognized him. Time had transformed the frightened little boy into a confident adult, but his eyes carried the same quiet gentleness she remembered from the old newspaper photograph. After introducing themselves, Ethan listened attentively as Rebecca unfolded the faded clipping she had carried with her since leaving the library. A warm smile slowly crossed his face. "I haven't seen this copy in years," he said softly. "My mother kept ours framed for a long time." Then, almost as if anticipating Rebecca's next question, he reached into a canvas shoulder bag resting beside his chair and carefully removed an old stuffed bear. The fabric had faded with age. One ear had been stitched back together years earlier, and several patches covered places where childhood had left its mark. Rebecca recognized it instantly. It was the same bear she believed she had seen clutched tightly against a frightened little boy sitting alone beneath the maple tree. Ethan gently turned the stuffed bear over in his hands before quietly sharing the story he had carried for most of his life. He explained that during the crowded community festival, he had wandered only a short distance away while chasing balloons floating above the crowd. Within moments, the people around him became unfamiliar, and panic quickly replaced excitement. Although the separation lasted less than an hour, those minutes felt endless to a frightened 6-year-old who believed he might never find his mother again. Volunteers, police officers, and complete strangers stayed with him until she finally pushed through the crowd and embraced him with overwhelming relief. The newspaper photograph captured only one brief moment before that reunion took place. According to Ethan, his mother never threw away the clipping because she wanted him to remember two important lessons. First, fear eventually passes. Second, kindness often arrives wearing the face of someone you've never met before. Throughout his childhood, whenever life became difficult, she would point toward the framed photograph hanging in their hallway and remind him that the world still contained people willing to stop and help complete strangers without expecting anything in return. The worn stuffed bear remained with Ethan for exactly the same reason. It wasn't valuable because of what it was. It was valuable because it reminded him that even during one of the most frightening moments of his childhood, he had never truly been alone. Only then did Rebecca finally describe what had happened during her walk through the park. She spoke carefully, explaining how she heard a little boy crying, how she sat beside him, how he whispered, "I can't find my mom," and how no one else seemed to acknowledge his presence. She described the worn stuffed bear, the old wooden bench, and the sentence he quietly repeated over and over again. She promised she'd come back. Ethan didn't interrupt. He simply listened with thoughtful attention until Rebecca finished. Then he smiled gently, not with disbelief, but with quiet understanding. After a long pause, he admitted something he rarely mentioned to anyone. Every year on the anniversary of the festival, he returned to the same park bench carrying fresh flowers. He never announced his visits or invited others to join him. He simply placed the flowers beside the bench as a private gesture of gratitude to the volunteers, police officers, and complete strangers who refused to walk past a frightened child all those years ago. Over time, other members of the community quietly adopted the same tradition, each leaving small reminders that compassion is often remembered long after fear has faded. Rebecca suddenly realized she hadn't uncovered a ghost story or an impossible mystery. She had encountered a place where memory, kindness, and community had become inseparably connected. Sometimes a familiar photograph, a meaningful location, and a deeply compassionate heart can combine to make an old story feel astonishingly present. As she left the park later that afternoon, Rebecca looked once more toward the weathered wooden bench beneath the maple tree and understood something she would carry with her forever. Sometimes what stays with us isn't the event itself, but the kindness shown during it. As Rebecca Collins drove home that evening, she realized the questions that had consumed her for days no longer mattered in the way they once had. She no longer needed to prove exactly why her experience in the park had felt so vivid or why every detail seemed to connect so perfectly with a photograph taken decades earlier. Some mysteries aren't solved by discovering impossible answers. Sometimes they're resolved by discovering something far more meaningful about ourselves. Rebecca had spent her entire career comforting frightened children, believing that kindness was simply part of her job. Yet this experience reminded her that compassion doesn't end when a difficult moment passes. It continues living inside the people who receive it, shaping the way they remember the world and influencing the choices they make for years to come. Ethan Brooks carried that lesson into adulthood because strangers refused to ignore one frightened little boy sitting alone on a park bench. His mother never allowed him to forget that complete strangers had paused their own lives to make sure another family's story ended safely. And Rebecca, without realizing it, had become part of that same chain of compassion simply because she followed the instinct that had guided her throughout her life. She stopped. She listened. She cared. Whether the experience was shaped by memory, emotion, or something science has yet to fully explain mattered far less than the lesson it left behind. Perhaps that's why stories like this continue to resonate across generations. In a world where so many people hurry from one responsibility to the next, it's easy to overlook someone quietly struggling only a few steps away. A child sitting alone on a bench, an elderly neighbor carrying heavy groceries, a stranger searching for help without knowing where to turn. Most of us will never remember every meeting, every conversation, or every ordinary afternoon that passes through our lives. But we almost always remember the people who chose kindness when we needed it most. Ethan remembered the volunteers who comforted him during the longest hour of his childhood. Rebecca remembered the strangers who stayed with her younger brother until her family found him years earlier. Those moments didn't become unforgettable because they were dramatic. They became unforgettable because someone cared enough to stop. The smallest act of kindness may seem insignificant to the person offering it, yet to someone living through fear or uncertainty, it can become the memory they carry for the rest of their lives. Long after names fade and places change, compassion often remains the clearest part of the story. Before we finish, we'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts. If you had been walking through that park and heard a little child crying alone, would you have stopped to help? Why do you think Rebecca Collins' experience felt so real, even after learning the remarkable history behind the old newspaper photograph? And looking back on your own life, has a complete stranger ever changed your future with one simple act of kindness that you've never forgotten? Share your story in the comments below because someone reading it today may find the encouragement they need. If stories like this remind you that compassion often leaves the deepest footprints, subscribe for more unforgettable true story-inspired mysteries. And if you thought this story was unforgettable, wait until our next documentary, because sometimes the moments we almost ignore become the ones we remember forever.